Hola, molt bon dia a tothom. Fem aquesta roda de premsa de presentació del tercer espectacle del Flaix de Tardor, que vam començar ahir justament, tant amb el To Moving Time com amb el Tiempo Todo Entero, l'Espai Lliure, i To Moving Time al Teatre Goya. En aquesta ocasió presentem perdó, li vaig dir Dante, que ara m'he fet aquí un cruce de noms. Presentem avui To Moving Time, que és l'espectacle que farem la Fundació Joan Brossa. Per això tenim aquí a la Georgina Oliva i és un espectacle que justament del Tim Etchells, que és un dels grans exploradors del llenguatge teatral del final del segle XX, principis del segle XXI. Per tant, vam pensar amb la Georgina que la Brossa era un molt bon espai per acollir aquest espectacle. Passo primer la paraula a la Georgina Oliva i després començarem a parlar de l'espectacle amb el Tyrone Huggins.
Bé, doncs per part meva només donar les gràcies al Narcís Puig per fer-nos entrar dins a la Fundació Joan Brossa dins del mapa del Flaix de Tardor. I no sé si escolteu un artista que està cridant pel fons, perdoneu. I aquest tipus de col·laboracions, però sobretot tenir a Force Entertainment i artistes com el Tyrone Huggins, per nosaltres ens ajuda molt a consolidar l'esperit de la brossa i amb aquest tipus de teatre que és crític però al mateix temps juganer. I res, jo només volia com agrair aquesta col·laboració i la intervenció d'artistes d'aquesta talla. Moltes gràcies.
Gràcies, Georgina. Comencem a parlar ara de l'espectacle. L'espectacle és una col·laboració entre la companyia Forced Entertainment, dirigida per el Tim Etchells, i el Tyrone Huggins, que tenim aquí present. Forced Entertainment sí que ha estat a Barcelona algunes vegades. La darrera, si no recordo malament, va ser les obres completes de Shakespeare en una taula, que eren les 26 obres que es van fer en el lliure. I el Tyrone, que és un actor conegut sobretot per la seva carrera teatral, però que també ha fet cinema i televisió, no havia estat encara mai a Barcelona, per tant serà un plaer acollir-lo per primera vegada. Com sabeu, el Tim Etchells és un dels creadors britànics que ha experimentat més amb el llenguatge teatral. Um, és un home que ha posat el públic a dintre l'escenari, ha fet dialogar durant hores a dos intèrprets en una conversa que no s'acabava. El que vam veure aquí va treballar també amb teatre d'objectes. En aquest cas és un format, podríem dir que més tradicional, tot i que el text penso que no té res de tradicional. És un actor que diu un text sobre una cosa que, sobretot jo diria que el cinema i la literatura han especulat bastant, que és sobre la possibilitat de viatjar en el temps. Aquesta producció es va estrenar l'any 2019, portant quasi 50 funcions a diversos països del món. I per començar, per passar-li la paraula al Tyrone, li preguntaria d'on neix aquesta col·laboració amb el Tim Etchells i amb la companyia Force Entertainment, i que ens expliqui una mica quina és la base, quin és que ens faci una presentació també de l'espectacle de To Moving Time.
Certainly, and thank you very much indeed. Yes, the origin of the relationship with Forced Entertainment goes right back to probably the early 1980s. I co-founded a theatre company in Leeds called Impact Theatre Cooperative, and we were an experimental visual. We devised our own work. I was the set builder within the company as well as a performer. And we toured the UK quite extensively, and it turned out we went to a university in the south of England called Exeter, where there were some students who liked our work, and they decided to set up their own theatre company and to base it in Sheffield. At the time, we were based in Leeds, and Leeds is about 30 miles north of Sheffield. Very early on, we were invited to see some of their new work as they started their company, and it was fascinating because they were using techniques that we hadn't explored, but that were, in a way, experimental in the way that we were experimenting with theatre form. Our company only lasted about 7 years. That was the beginning of the relationship. So I saw their work over many years and many different productions. And then about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I was working on a script of Tim's at the National Theatre in the UK, in London. And out of that experience, Tim spoke to me about possibly collaborating with the company, which for me felt like rejoining or discovering or connecting up with a family of theatre artists that I'd watched develop over nearly 40 years. And the collaboration that Tim proposed was this idea of a narrative, a solo show in which a protagonist, a character, talks about what would happen if he could travel in time. So in about 2018, Tim showed me about 20 minutes worth of script. We talked about it and set the plans together for working together in January of 2019. The idea was that he would deliver a full script by the end of the year, and then we would start rehearsals in January. In fact, the script arrived only about 2 weeks before we started rehearsals, and I looked at it and immediately I was terrified. I thought, this piece of work is so extraordinary and the learning of it is so difficult, I don't know how I'm going to do it. And we had 2 weeks of rehearsal scheduled before the first performance, and I received the script 2 weeks before we started rehearsal. So the journey was going to be very, very tight. The process we ended up with was basically working through the script bit by bit and leading up to that very first performance. That very first performance was my most frightening experience on stage ever. I had never done anything that scared me so much. It also turned out that we had that the script was more than we had planned. It was an hour and a half long. We only wanted a piece that was about an hour, and so we set to cutting it back. And I'd been trying to learn an hour and a half worth of material in those 2 weeks. When we cut it back, it became more manageable. But I think coming from a background as a set builder, I thought I would like to have a set. And what could that be? I think the idea originally we'd spoken about was it was a show that we could take into lecture theatres or into any other spaces. But actually what we turned out with was something that has a much more theatrical presentation. It does need the lights to work with it. It needs the space that I created with a circle of cards around me. And what the play does and what the text does is it starts off with this figure who enters and starts to talk about their own desire to improve the state of the world if they could travel in time. As this exploration continues, the complexities of moving in time start to emerge, i.e., what would happen if you met yourself? What would happen if you made an adjustment in the past that had a catastrophic effect in the future? And it becomes much more and more tangled and complicated as the piece evolves. And what is very particular about the language in the piece is that Tim has not constructed language that has a clear logic. It has an internal logic, which as you speak and as the audience receives it, they start to get drawn into the internal logic of the piece, and it becomes a kind of process of, I'd hate to say this word, but hypnotism, that you're drawing the audience into a world that sort of initially starts to feel a bit normal, but as it goes further and further in, you start to realize that that the world that this character is speaking to you about it has the contemporary reality, but it has a complex layer of personal and and it draws on many elements that we all understand would happen if you did start to mess around with time. So that's how the whole journey of the piece started and arrived at the performance that I'm about to give in Barcelona over the next few days.
Moltes gràcies, Tyrone. És un text molt basat crec que ho has dit tu en la teva resposta una mica, en aquest i si tal cosa, i si passés tal cosa, i si... O sigui, que va com obrint moltes opcions. És complicat com a actor no perdre't en tots els camins que va obrint el text.
Yes, most definitely, because there is often the phrase, if I could travel in time, if I could travel in time, and that opens up each kind of chapter of the story. And early on, I did find myself jumping, and because it's a maze, you then have to either try and find your way back to where you should be in the laying out of the narrative, or you have to accept that you've lost a moment. And that, for me, is the most disappointing thing about it. I look at it as walking on stepping stones. And as you step on each stone, it lifts into the air behind you as you step onto the next one. And as it lifts into the air, that's what the audience are receiving. And the big danger is to turn around and look at it again. So if you do make a slip, you cannot stay there. You have to stay in the moment. The piece wholly demands that as a performer, I stay in the moment so that the audience are in the moment. But what happens sometimes with an audience is they'll hear something that connects to them personally, and for a moment they will drift off and reflect on that moment and then come back to the piece. So I'm continually moving forward on these stepping stones of ideas and moments and emotions and humor that then lift into the air for the audience to absorb, reflect on, and then rejoin the journey. So it's a risky piece of work, and that's what terrified me the first time I did it, was that I did get lost in it at least 2 or 3 times. Nowadays, I'm much more assured, but the danger still exists.
Sí, obrirem les preguntes dels periodistes, vull dir que quan vulgueu podeu preguntar. Jo aprofito mentrestant per preguntar una mica sobre l'espai i la relació amb l'actor. El format és un monòleg amb un actor al mig de l'escenari, però que a través d'una petita escenografia té l'espai com molt marcat i d'on no pot sortir. Realment és una feina d'estar com molt centrat en un punt. M'agradaria preguntar-li al Tyrone això, sobretot al principi, suposo que ara ja després de tantes funcions està com més assumit, què li va suposar com a actor? Perquè realment la possibilitat de mobilitat de l'actor està molt limitada per un espai molt petit, però que realment marca un espai de joc molt, molt reduït.
Where that came from was I wanted to create a map of a journey for myself to help me keep on track with where I was in the journey. And the idea of a circle that was like a clock face came to me. When I initially presented that to Tim, I think he was very uncertain whether it was necessary or helpful. But what it did was it then set up for the lighting designer, for instance, the opportunity to create shadows so throughout the performance, the shadows move around me, following almost the nature of a clock. It's a very subtle thing, but it sort of creates a slight movement. I, physically, more or less stand in the same place for the whole performance. What we were exploring was the idea that it isn't about the physicality of my presentation. It is about the language and the presence that and staying in the moment. So it's become quite natural now, but it was initially limiting. I wanted to add gestures and a whole load of physical aspects to the piece, but as Tim guided me through it, I began to understand that it's actually being stationary and more or less static throughout the performance was a way for the language and for the atmosphere that we're creating to grow, and for that to become the focus for an audience rather than... There are a couple of moments where I use a change of sense of physicality in the piece to disrupt that and then bring the audience back to it again. So those moments, I think, they'll become clear when people see the performance, that there is that something slightly disrupts the energy in the room and then brings it back into focus. So it was I think it was the guide of the fact that Tim is very experienced and sort of has been exploring the connection between language and presence and being in the moment. That's what I think has helped to guide this performance. And I think what he saw in me was my potential to harness the energy that he wanted to bring into the room with this piece.
No sé si hi ha alguna pregunta, si teniu alguna pregunta als periodistes o encara no n'hi ha cap.
Tenim una pregunta, Narcís.
Doncs endavant.
En Magí Camps, de La Vanguardia, pregunta: el personatge aconsegueix algun dels objectius de modificar el món en positiu?
That's a fascinating question, because that would rely upon an audience's sense of what positive is. Positive is, from the point of view of the figure, because they're exploring possibilities, some of them will take you into a world that it might have its dangers and its sense of I don't know, a sense of danger about it. But then others are just become purely frivolous, and it's whether or not you find frivolousness a positive thing. But one of the things that also over the times I've been performing it is just how connected these ideas are to the world, because what Tim has embedded in the text are real life elements, and they're philosophically real life. They're about the idea of, would it be an advantage to have one person able to manipulate time? If you think that's positive, if they're doing all the right things, if they're making the world better, because that's the very first thing that this character says: if I could travel in time, I'd try to make the world better. As they go along the journey and they accumulate the opportunity to make the world better, some of that looks like it's positive, but some of it also starts to become quite dangerous. It's you realize that power has its positives and its negatives. Despite the intentions of doing the best for the world, one person who has an enormous amount of power can also do the world a good amount of damage. Does that answer the question?
De moment no tenim cap més pregunta.
Ok, jo faig una última pregunta, si no n'apareix cap més, si us sembla, que m'agradaria saber, suposo que això a la persona a qui s'hauria de preguntar és al Tim Etchells, però com que no el tenim i es coneixen molt bé, li pregunto al Tyrone, que és com vau decidir o com va aparèixer justament aquest tema de la possibilitat de viatjar en el temps, que és un tema que realment s'ha tocat molt, moltes vegades de manera més d'entertainment, diguem, més a pel·lícules per provocar un cert joc o per provocar uns canvis. Com vau arribar a aquest tema?
I think that looking at the way that Tim works and understanding him through this piece, I think it is because there have been many versions of the idea of being able to travel in time that internally the piece sort of subtly references those. And that's what makes it kind of universal, is that we all have a sense of a film or a story or a moment where the idea of time travel appeals to us. So it's an appealing foundation. I also think that Tim is very interested in alternatives. Or is a good word for Tim. This or that, what is the possibility of when you're given an option? And of course, the world of time travel gives you many options, because you could travel forward or you could travel back. And if you travel back, what are you influencing that will then affect forwards? So you start to create a world of possibilities, and I think possibilities also seems to be one of the things that Tim has a very, very strong interest in. What is the possibility of something? What is the possibility of being good if you could travel in time? What's the possibility of doing terrible damage if you can travel in time? So I think in looking at the work of forced entertainment there, and I was an associate artist with the company for 3 years, from 2020, I think it was, till last year, so it must have been 2021. I became an associate artist, which meant that I was working with them on 3 levels. One was to do with bringing in people to their circle that might not, in the UK, that might not be accustomed to the work of forced entertainment. 2 was being in the rehearsal room as they created their new work. So I was dramaturg on 2 of their last pieces. And 3 was organizationally sitting on or talking to them as an organization about their strategies in terms of work. I think the group, I mean, they've been together as a group of people for the 40 years that I've been watching them. And I've watched them grow older. I've watched them sort of in different configurations on different pieces of work. But I think with Tim as the driving force creatively within the setup, and that has emerged over time and become much more clear over time, I think he is constantly looking for what are the options and alternatives that you can bring to an audience through looking at that or word, or the possibility that that we are constantly as individuals facing choice. And if you set up choice on stage for an audience, how do they respond to it? And if they have multiple choices all the time, they're given choices. What does it clarify anything for them, or does it leave them in confusion? And I think that's where the challenge of forced entertainment's work is. How does it clarify, and how does it confuse?
Moltes gràcies, Tyrone. Paula, hi ha alguna pregunta més?
No tenim cap més pregunta.
Doncs moltes gràcies a la premsa per ser aquí, moltes gràcies a la Georgina, moltes gràcies, Tyrone. Ens veiem aquest cap de setmana a la Fundació Brossa i us seguirem informant de cosetes del Flaix de Tardor.
Gràcies. Una abraçada.
Brilliant, and I look forward to seeing all of you in person in
Yeah.
Barcelona and to hear what you make of the show. Please come.
See you.
See you. See you.